My name is Oscar Clark. I am Chief Strategy Officer at Fundamentally Games. I've been around the industry for about 22 years, working in games as a service primarily. I'm often associated with mobile, particularly mobile free-to-play. However, what many people won't know is I started out in PC land. I started out in the era of dial-up modems. So I was running games as a service for PC games long before we ever had a dream of running games on mobile phones. So what we're trying to do today is go through some of our recent analysis of what's happening in the PC games market in particular, but really it's about the fundamental principles about how we create great experiences for players and charge for them. I think the charging for them bit is important because I believe that commercial games can be great. And in fact, I think that commercial games have to be great to be commercial. But we often find that there have been some really poor choices being made by certain publishers and developers about how they charge for games. We're going to talk about some of those. We're going to talk about some of the kind of issues. But I'm hoping that I will paint a picture for you about how to think differently about how you're going to charge for your PC game. A lot of these techniques are, not surprisingly, derived from lessons learned in mobile. But I think it's really important to understand that there's a difference in terms of player expectation, mode of use, and behaviour that happens in a PC context. It's not the kind of pick up and throw away kind of content we'd experience on mobile, so it has different qualities and different needs to understand. We have to appreciate the values that are happening for the player, and context is everything for me. The context of why we continue playing, the context of the lifestyle that the player is experiencing, the mode of use of the device and how it frames what we expect to do in a game. All of these are factors that derive the player value. So let's kick off and talk properly. Let's start off by talking about the thing that we all know, the paid for thing, the one-time joyful experience. I use the Stanley Parable because it's still one of my favourite one-time gem games. It's also interesting because it's a game you play lots of times. That's the point if you know the game. And anyone who wants to ask me my favourite ending, it's the broom cupboard ending. And only people who've played it will know what I mean by that. And hopefully I gave you a little bit of a chuckle. Like I say, you have to know what the broom cupboard ending is to get it. But this is not a game that you're going to buy in-app purchase for. I don't think. I think you could make a Stanley Parable-like experience, but it wouldn't be the Stanley Parable. So what I think is the first differentiator is to think about what it is that this game is about. Is it essentially a repeatable, sustainable experience over long periods of time? Or is it a nugget of joy? And I think that's really key. I think the other thing to think about with pay up front as well, though, is what is it about? Why do we care about it? Is pay up front inherently a good thing? Is pay up front premium? I want to stop us using the term premium to describe pay up front. I think it's a classic mistake and it sends us down some really terrible paths. So if you don't know about Duke Nukem Forever, I've been a massive fan of Duke Nukem for a long time. And they spent about 12, 15 years making the next one, the fourth one. Duke Nukem 3D was fantastic. We played it on WirePlay 22 years ago. It was awesome. We were expecting not a lot from Duke Nukem Forever, and it only had to be bad, and I'd been okay with it. But it was terrible. They had a full price console charge on $40 or whatever it was, £40, something like that. And it was terrible. It destroyed Duke Nukem Forever. So having a pay up front does not guarantee it being a good thing. In fact, I'd argue it's almost like it was an evil thing to do, to charge for something which simply wasn't of merchantable quality. So premium does not equal pay up front. It's a very big difference. And actually, the essential part of it is that these guys missed the point about what they were making. They just tried to get something out the door when they should have been making something that the players who loved Duke Nukem valued. So understanding what value is really key. Does that mean free-to-play is necessarily right? Well, we know about the elephant in the room when it comes to Star Wars Battlefront 2. We're still feeling the legislative and the player backlash that came out of essentially a massive cock-up. Now, I don't know the full details. I wasn't involved in it, but as I understand it, the decision to add loot crates to the aggressive extent that they did was taken out of the hands of the core team. Now, I may not be right about that, but the point is that what they did is they took stuff that players would naturally have expected to be in the game and put it into a randomized fashion, which was essentially gacha-like. Now, any of you who understand gacha, i.e. the kind of Japanese mechanism with the plastic balls where you get randomized toys, that is a mechanism which works in mobile very well. And actually there is a delight in surprise. But when you hide things, when you don't communicate, where the proportionality isn't there, where you're starting to target people who are not necessarily able to make adult decisions, then we're into really problematic areas. Now, I actually don't think the game was as bad as it's painted out now. They did some changes to it. It's a lot more manageable balance. But the idea of charging up front and hiding content that people would have thought would have been available in these randomized loot boxes, and to basically trigger this kind of like, I don't want to describe it as gambling. It's a very different thing for gambling. Gambling requires you to cash out. And I don't think in most cases you are cashing out. But you can't hide from the fact that there is still a social payoff of having items in theory. We see that in Fortnite. The social payoff of having cosmetic items. So is IAP inherently evil because we've got this example of this particular way of doing it? I don't think IAP is inherently evil. I think that it was done badly. And we need to separate out when IAP is done well versus when IAP is done badly. Battle Royale is a kind of a clear example, whereas it's not. I think it's self-intrinsically not evil. I mean, I know there are some people who are not necessarily fans of it. We've basically got essentially the metaverse here. I think what's interesting for me about Battle Royale is not just the in-app purchase of the sort of micropayments of items and cosmetics, it's the Battle Pass. And yes, I know that Fortnite isn't the only place where Battle Passes work, but there's something really intrinsic about what Battle Passes mean. They mean you play more, you get more. So the more you invest in a game, the more value that you love comes from that game. And the more you play, the more of that value that you love keeps coming. That fundamental principle, I think, is really profound. That is what we need to tap into. So let's sort of think about what it is that's going on for players when they're playing. Why are we paying for things? Well, we're paying. Let me step back a little bit. There are some core principles that go on when we buy anything. There was a study done in the 1960s. In fact, 1960, a guy called Bauer did a research paper called Consumer Behavior as Risk-Taking Activity. So if you think about consumer behavior as risk-taking activity, what's going on there? Well, we haven't got necessarily an idea about what is interesting about the thing you're trying to sell me. You've got to make me anticipate the thing that you're going to offer me. You've got to create a reason for me to look forward to the asset that you want me to buy. So looking forward to these things is a really key part. So creating a sense of desire and anticipation is really key. If you don't do that, no one buys it. Similarly, you have to communicate the opportunity cost. If I don't know why I need to do it now, if I don't have a call to action, if I don't know the opportunity cost of getting this versus something else, people don't act. So understanding why we buy anything is really important to understanding how we're going to charge for our games. So anticipation and opportunity costs are really key. Social capital is also key. The social value, what will other people think of me if I buy this thing, has an enormous part to play. And the important thing is it's not the viral kind of Facebook era stuff where we nag you to basically link to your friends in order to get you resources. That is not social capital. That's the opposite of social capital. That's social annoyance. What we need is something where you go, oh, that's cool. I want that too. So creating real, genuine social capital, which is actually beneficial, where seeing these other people getting this thing means I care more. I remember with PlayStation Home, these amazing moments where you'd have 60 people turning up in a single instance of a scene, all wearing the gold suit with the gold afro, doing the Cabbage Patch dance. There was no intrinsic gameplay there, and yet they bought the most expensive thing on the store, and they organised themselves enough to make sure that they all ended up in the scene, and only those people. We can only take 60 people in a scene. So the amount of social capital value effort required to do that is astounding. And if we don't have some social value in what we offer people, why would they buy anything? So we have to think about those things. And one of the things I think is really important for anyone who's trying to think about pricing or selling in any way to do with games in particular, but generally as well, you can't make people buy. Now, okay, that's not quite true. You can manipulate people once, maybe twice. But that is not good business. A business is repeatable. A business is sustainable. If we are going to create a business out of our game, we need things that they love, that they want to do again. And that means they have to be willing to set aside the other things that they should be doing or should be spending their money or could be spending their money on and choose your game. Choose your game. They have to be able to give themselves permission. You cannot give them permission. They can only give it to themselves. So if we are going to create reasons for people to spend money in any game, whether it's upfront, whether it's in-game, doesn't matter, we have to create anticipation, understanding of opportunity costs, the social capital, but also the space for them to give themselves permission to buy. And actually this isn't quite the same, but it does tap into a lot of the kind of values that we think about when you think about why they play. Well, what are they looking for? What does value look like in a game? And part of that is about control. I want to feel I'm in charge. I want to have some autonomy. They're part of the value proposition. If you're going to give people a reason, the permission to give themselves, then knowing why they play is going to be critical. If you're going to create anticipation, understanding what values your game has in intrinsic psychological basis is going to be key to how you communicate anticipation. If you think about completion as well, games are one of the few spaces where we can actually complete experiences, and also social capital. We can actually share. I like to think of games as being unique because, unlike any other medium, we're a verb. We're a doing thing. And that's because we're a doing thing, we can also demonstrate competence. How often can we safely experience all of these factors in our real lives? Games separate ourselves from those realities and allow us to feel in control, to allow us to escape into a space where we can complete tasks cleanly, where we can see and be seen, where we can also show competence and skill. So that's the values, and we need to think about those when we're communicating those pieces we talked about before. The anticipation, the fear of missing out, the social capital, and of course that important abnegation part. So what does that mean? So when we're looking at paying up front or paying in game, we have to think about a few things. So we're going to look at some of these in a bit more detail. So obviously, whatever you set as a price sets the expectation. That's a really important part there we'll come into. But if you actually, let's talk about it now. If I have a game that is at the lowest price point on an app store, let's say it's $1, and I have another game that's $5. If I just look at the prices, and they're essentially identical screen grabs, which do we think has the greatest value? Does anyone have a view? I mean, if you saw something at $5.99 and the same game basically, maybe some different descriptions, but basically the same game at $1.99, what do you think people's expectation will be? Well, they'll think, in most cases, that the higher price game was more valuable. Because it's been set at a different price, it sets expectation. Now, the game has to live up to that value, but it's an interesting factor. There's also a principle about price elasticity of demand. What's interesting is the difference between free and paid, which we'll get to later, but also that the level of resistance when you increase price is not always as strong as you think. It can be. There are certain categories. There's a great piece done by, I forget the name of the person. In my article I did for PC Game Insider, I kind of quoted a website which looked at specific price points and what they said to people about what their expectation. So if you have a game which is clearly has a production values of an indie title, and you charge $40 for it, that's clearly broken. It's not going to work. But if you charge, say, $15 for it, that could work. But if it's a clearly short game experience, charging more than $5 might be too much. So there's a certain combination between price, production value, and expectation, which actually determines how people look at your game. We have to have a decision about what our price means in order to know what our paywall is going to look like. In other words, there's always a barrier, whether it's spending money or free, there still will be a barrier of effort and price that's going to affect the volume of people that we're going to get to actually decide to go for our game. And yes, we can build anticipation. Yes, we can build fear of missing out. In fact, we have to. The compensation, though, is building anticipation versus the resistance that we're going to get. But even not having enough space on my hard drive can be enough of a resistance to stop people buying even a free-to-play game. Anyway, the next thing to think about is whether we're going to charge in-game. Now, obviously, whether you have to charge in-game or not is going to come down to what are your fundamental costs for your game. Do your costs increase over time? Do they continue over time? If you charge up front but you're running servers in the back end, you're basically eating into your profitability continuously. There's a mismatch between player experience and your costs. Now that's actually no good for the player as well as no good for you, because it means that you cannot continue to invest in the experience to improve it because there's no way of upselling it. So thinking about your engagement with your player, what the patterns of that, and the risks you're building if you have an upfront price and no ongoing revenue, and yet people will continue to take charges. You can get to the stage where you can go bust because you've just broken all your server costs because you're not getting enough new users and they're not churning fast enough. Why would you want to be in a situation where you basically have to rely on players leaving and quitting your game to be able to have any profit? That seems to me crazy. Yes, we can look at DLC. DLC can be great. It can also be terrible. There are examples of games where about a third of the users are buying the DLC and they're buying multiple DLC. That's great. But there are also lots of cases where DLC is a diminishing return. Because at each stage where you're going to release a new piece of content that they're going to buy, they're going to have to get over another paywall. In fact, it's a worse paywall in general because you've already told them what it's going to cost, and now you're asking them for more. You're asking them to have an imagination of how much extra you're going to give them for that extra money that they've already sunk cost. They're going to suffer from the sunk cost fallacy. Your players are going to assume, I've already spent, therefore it should be mine. So you have to be very careful how you communicate DLC, how you deliver value. The last thing you want is to have a DLC which looks like you held back stuff from the original game. Because then you just get resentment, you get frustration, and you end up with people just not buying it. And that is a tragedy. If you're spending time and you're investing in sustaining an ongoing experience, what should be happening is players should be getting more excited about your game. They should be investing more in your game. And if they're not, then you've got something wrong in the way you're building your game, I would argue. Now, obviously, again, goes back to that original cause. Are we talking about a one-time gem or are we talking about an ongoing sustainable experience? One of the things we often miss is we assume that you're buying a thing, a game, a customization object, a new power-up, a new strategy that you can play in a game. But actually you're not. What people are actually buying is their expectation of future value. So whenever we're thinking about pricing and charging inside PC games, and just the same as any other product or service, we have to understand what the value is. What is it that players will care about and anticipate the value of? And if we can work out what that is, maybe that is the upfront payment for the game. Maybe that is items within the game that are cosmetic. Maybe that is items within the game which are about extending their playability. Well, we'll get into content later. I'll come back to that. Anyway, so let's take an example of DLC done badly. Anyone remember this? This is the horse armor that you got in Skyrim that you charged extra for. Terrible, just terrible. I actually bought it. I know it's embarrassing, but I bought it. But that's a terrible example. You know, just not good. I think some people did get it as a add-on when you purchased it up front, but I'm using it because it's a cliched example, but I think it's interesting. But DLC done well, I think particularly the New Vegas Fallout DLCs were just superb. I had no resentment buying. The only issue I had with the Fallout DLCs was they didn't allow me to kind of feel like the game was continuing. There were always sort of side missions. Once I'd finished the whole game, I didn't feel like they were kind of continuing the story. They felt like I had to go back and take a different, pathway. Now, that's me being ultra critical. I loved it, absolutely loved it, and I think it's a really, amazing experience. And then we've got another Fallout 76. Where now? I don't know how many people have paid attention to Fallout 76. I'm a massive Fallout fan, if you hadn't guessed. I'm currently obsessed with Fallout 76, but I'll explain why. I did not buy it when it came out because it was terrible. It was broken. It was busted. Actually, a lot of the Fallout games have massive bugs, but that's another subject. But they were charging me full price, and then there's all the DLC, the in-app purchase stuff in it as well. And I wasn't interested. Then it came out on Microsoft Xbox Game Pass. I've got the Xbox Ultimate thing, so therefore I get that. And one of the magical things actually is the recently released streaming. So I'm using the Ryzer, a bit of a promotion for Ryzer because I love the Razer kind of a Kishi controller. Means I can play Fallout 76 on my phone streaming, which is awesome. But what it took them essentially making it free to play for me to be interested, to give it a go. And as I've got more and more into it, and they've removed a lot of the issues of playing, I've found myself spending more money than I would have had to spend on the upfront charge. So it can be done. It can be done. And also the interesting thing is because they've made it a service and ongoing experience, because they're continuously improving it, that has been a massive driver for me to sustain my interest. And the more I've been involved and invested, the more I want to be invested. There's a problem with this idea of charging an in-app purchase. This is actually an old mobile game. This is Pitfall. Back in Activision did a Pitfall game in mobile on iOS. They charged up front and they did in-app purchase as well. And it was a basically financial flop. Why am I using this old mobile example when I'm talking about PC games? Because it's the same fundamental principle. If you test this, I'm pretty sure if we had access to decent data, it would come out. I've observed it myself. I've observed it more cleanly and more data driven on a mobile basis. But basically, if you charge up front, you cap the expected willingness of players to spend money in a game. So in a game like this, they basically charged, I think it was like $2.99, $3.99, I can't remember what it was, up front. And the average spend on in-app purchases was capped around 1x, 2x that level, as I remember. Other games that didn't have the pay up front, you could see people were spending tens of dollars, hundreds of dollars paying in this game. We had actually worked on a city building game where we had somebody spending hundreds of thousands of dollars inside that game. Now, the important thing to note is we checked up that these weren't people who were crazy. These weren't people who were kind of spending more than they should or could afford. This was people who actually had lots of money. It was a footballer's wife. She was showing off with her group of friends how much money she had. Now, actually, as it happens, I'm not advocating that principle in PC games. Don't think it's quite the same thing. But what I'm saying is, if we put a price up front, there is a risk, and we have to bear this in mind in our strategy, that what we're doing is we're capping the expectation of value for this game. Which means that if we continually deliver releasable, new and interesting content, we cap the likely willingness of somebody to spend money on those things. And we have to be very careful, and we need to test this. We need to test what we're doing. I'm not saying don't ever charge up front. I'm saying that when you do so, it comes at a price. And that price is not necessarily straightforward. It's often in the cap on the lifetime value of the player. So we need to think about what that means. And also, like I say, the whole idea of thinking about the player's journey longer than just their one-time playthrough. There are lots of games out there that have had, year, 2 years. Let's take something like RuneScape with 20 years. A living game like RuneScape, 20 years worth of ongoing play. That doesn't happen because you charge up front. That happens because you create a beautiful, loving, gorgeous experience which is built around players' expectation of value. Not every game is going to be a RuneScape. But there's nothing to stop us looking at what our game is, understanding how extendable it is and how we build engagement. And when we're looking at how we build our business model, how we build our charging mechanism for that, that should be informed by what players care about. Cosmetics can be really important. What's interesting is every wave of new games, new game genres on PC, mobile and other platforms has started with cosmetics and generally ended up moving into features. You can even have spaces. So actually this is a screen grab from PlayStation Home. Oscar's Lobster Mania was actually made because I got criticised for the enthusiasm I had eating lobster. Long story. They genuinely made a lobster-based game based on me eating lobster. I even have a hat in it. But anyway, the point being that this was a specific space, a specific environment that people bought so they could share it with their friends. There are lots of things about cosmetics which aren't necessarily the obvious kind of my character. What's interesting about my Fortnite is I don't get to see my avatar most of the time. The interesting about having a space is that you get to see my space and you come to my space. So there's lots of things like that. Not every game is going to be able to use them. Currency is something that's used a lot. Now, I'm not a fan of currency as a chargeable thing, although obviously it's something you end up having to do. It's very useful for the point of view of it being a database item, but there's no emotion when you buy coins. But people spend a lot of money on coins. What you've got to remember if you're going to have offers and you're going to use coins as something you're going to give people is, why does the player want it? Why? What's in it for them? You've got to be very careful you're not undermining your reward process. You've got to be very careful that you're not allowing people to skip gameplay and to actually focus on what it is they're going to convert those coins into. Now, coins is just one thing. It could be resources, it could be blueprints, it could be any number of things. But understanding the kind of cosmetic currency elements, that's the really kind of key. Understand what it is, the kind of economy of your game is doing, and bypassing your economy and the consequences it has. Why do people care? Why are they interesting? Often buying choice is really interesting, and I think this is kind of a really kind of key thing. The idea of a archetype character I can play in a game becoming available, being able to use it for free for a period of time, but then buying it to be able to keep using it after it leaves the kind of general public availability. And actually that being something allows me to think about strategic choice as well. So gameplay choice, strategic choice. One of the things that I think is really frustrating is when you see people selling, here's a +1 sword, here's a +2 sword, here's a +3 sword. I don't care about the +1 sword when I've got the +3 sword. But if I've got a sword of fire +1 and a sword of water +2, there are times when the sword of fire +1 is better than the sword of water +2. So me making the decision about which sword to bring in is a layer of gameplay. And understanding that importance where actually, another example is I have a bunch of heroes, but I'm only really needing one at a time. If you have nothing in your gameplay, that means there's reasons to choose. I'm just going to load all the XP into one character, that's it. Why would I need to put any money or investment, time, experience into any others? Well, if you think about it as choice, if you make those choices meaningful, then you'll find that people start thinking about that strategically and start engaging with those characters more meaningfully and start to care about them. Most of the biggest flaws in monetization is because you've forgotten why the player will care. Even things like, like I said, strategy, Hearthstone, every new card is a new choice. The interesting thing about this is a new card that I've got affects you, the other player. And it's got to be positive. If the effect of me having a new strategy is that I beat you, that is a broken game. I don't even want to get into pay to win, because that is a mistake of a term. It's a bad presumption. It's just a broken game. There should be nothing intrinsically wrong with buying things that make my gameplay more interesting. But if you just buy things that make you win, it isn't fun. Even in the cultures in the kind of Asian community where pay to win is a much more acceptable term, if you just win by chucking down money, it's only got a certain level of longevity. So we need to think more smartly about how we use all of these things that we know players value. But aspiration is also a really interesting one. What's interesting for me about aspiration goods in particular is the idea that we are looking forward to unlocking the conditions in which will then allow us to make a purchase. So there's a striving, there's a grit required to get to that thing, which creates added value through gameplay for that object. But what's weird is that once we've got it, we don't care anymore about it. Well, that's not true. We do care. We care that we have it. But what having a new Dreadnought or the Vorpal Blade that lets us kill Jabberwocky gives us is an understanding that we can now kill Jabberwockies. That's now part of our game. You may not have it, and it's great that I've got the prestige that I've got it and you don't, but it doesn't inherently keep me playing the game. I need another aspiration item for me to want to continue playing the game for that. So thinking about these factors, that hopefully what I'm getting across is the types of goods, the types of value aren't just about one-off moments. They're actually about thinking about the shadow that each of these elements casts. Pricing isn't just about the number, it's about the emotion that goes with it. And most of the mistakes, in my opinion, that we've seen in PC game pricing is because we've lost sight of the player emotion. We focus instead on how much money we can get from them. And I think when we do that, we simply break games. Bundling is also an important thing. So bundling together, setting expectation of value, buying these, I think we'll talk about this later, but the idea of consumable goods and capacity goods and generator goods and aspiration goods, all these valuable ways of thinking about what makes PC games work, really kind of inherent part of the decision-making process, not just the price. It's the frequency we want them. It's the frequency we use them, whether they are used up or not, how many of them we can get, how many we can store. And actually offering bundles that package that in beautiful, emotional, rich ways can communicate the things we talked about before. Anticipation, fear of missing out. This is a time-locked bundle. It's only available once. It's only something which has value for you as a starter. But if you don't get it, you're going to lose out. It has a social capital because you are now part of the community by having this item. You pass that social goal potentially. So all of these things really matter, and they're all based around increasing the value of the experience. Another thing I think is really interesting, and something we've been talking about with some of our clients on the PC side, is particularly if you're going to go free to play later at some point, but you're not sure whether you're going to go free to play at the beginning or not. People are often looking at kind of having some mechanism to have in early access, have a charging mechanism and then switch. Switching is always incredibly painful and really to be avoided if you can. But when you're a new game, you need to find some way of getting some money to get going or to build the features you need. So what do you do? One thing that's always interesting, particularly if you want to incentivize the early players is to look at how you can create founders packs or pioneer packs, whatever you want to call them, things which have ongoing value for those players regardless, because they got in early. They need to be time limited, they need to be clear, so you can have effectively very similar value to the pay up front, but you time limit it. You say to them, this is going to be a pioneer pack, here's some stuff that free-to-play players can play, but here's the good stuff. And if you buy this early package, we'll give you access to our VIP program for the next 9 months, or 6 months, or 3 months, whatever is the right time frame for you. But again, it comes down to what is the value for the player? Why would it be worth them investing in your game? And can you do that in such a way where you don't create a greater barrier to accessing your game than would otherwise exist? We want to encourage as many people to play our game as possible, because inside our game, we know that if they love it, they're going to continue loving it and growing it. That's what free-to-play is about. It's getting rid of the barriers and stopping other people selling our game against a list of millions, thousands of other, whatever it is, the number of games on the App Store, and instead getting them to come into our experience where we can show them the value, that we care about the experience, that we're building something that's meaningful and bringing them on board. And if we bring them on board, we can show them that love in a way that gives them desire to spend, desire to want to invest, to engage with us. A collaborative experience. And Pioneer Packs are a really interesting way of thinking about that, to be able to find ways of getting people to make that initial spend in the earliest of days and feel special as an ongoing basis. And what's interesting as well is because if you include certain things in a Pioneers pack, it means you have players who have those things. When you've gone live, they can then be aspirational, because your non-Pioneer players can say, oh, look at that outfit, I wish I could have that. What do you mean I can't have it because I missed out on the Pioneer thing? Oh, look, there's a variation of it I can get. The Pioneers feel special. They show off what's really valuable and enjoyable in your game, and they basically signpost for other players the social capital. So that's why it's worth thinking about not just blanket ways of spending in your game, but also things that are time specific. I'm a massive fan of Season Pass and Battle Pass. I think what's interesting, I'm trying to differentiate these things. Season Pass for me is about narrative arc and new items that have become available in that period, cosmetics largely, but also functional pieces. Could even be, if you take Path of Exiles, it could be a complete kind of like rule change structure, essentially. Whereas a Battle Pass, for me, why I think it's interesting is that it's this ongoing comparison between, if you were a free user, you'd get this many upgrades, but you still get them. But if you're a paid user, you get these benefits in addition. There's ongoing value. The problem has happened recently with Battle Passes, though, where they've lost sight of what's really valuable to the player. They say things, oh, this will be good, but actually just copying a formula because you've seen it work in other games is not the same as actually making sure you've tested it with your players and what they care about and what matters in the dynamics of your game. Keeping the Battle Pass meaningful really matters. And subscription. Where's the role for subscription in all this? Well, obviously, Battle Pass Season Passes are often paid up front. So they're DLC-like in their kind of qualities. The important difference between Season Pass and Battle Pass and a DLC, in my opinion, though, is that they are predictable. They are going to happen on third Sunday of the month, or whatever the date is, and it's going to be every month. You could do it quarterly, don't get me wrong. Personally, I think you'd lose too many players if you do it quarterly. I think you need a daily, weekly and monthly cycle, but you need to do that in a way that you can manage as a company, whether you're small or large. Obviously, as a company, we're interested in live ops, supporting small to medium-sized companies so they can do that. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have a third party to do that. You need to think about what your team can sustain. But that, I think, is really important about this model of thinking about your pricing. What is your sustainability? What is your predictability? What is your frequency? Now, subscription can be really good for that. But there is a risk if you go down the gym membership model. What is a gym membership model, I hear you ask? Well, okay, maybe not. Are you getting people to pay money just because they've got an account? Or are you giving them more value because they are VIPs? Because they are putting money in on a systematic, regular basis, they're committing to it. How much value are you giving them? And are you still able to upsell them? Why would you want to upsell someone who's subscribing? I hear some people asking. Well, the reason is this. If you lock yourself into a fixed all-you-can-eat subscription, you are going to kill your game's economy. The reason is that you can no longer justify investing in new, exciting, shiny things. Because new, exciting, shiny things will not increase your subscription revenue. They will merely sustain it. So by having a subscription that's all you can eat, you cap the value of the game. And actually, it's not just about money chasing. It's about understanding how you can deliver more value for your players. So having a VIP program that has a subscription that gives oodles, gorgeous, massive amounts of value, fantastic. But by the way, you can also buy some other stuff. That is the way to think about subscriptions successfully for games. And we're seeing that when we look at these all-you-can-eat packages that have started to emerge recently and the ones that are dying versus the ones that are succeeding. Xbox Live Game Pass is my current favourite one. I'm obsessed with it. As a former PlayStation employee, I cannot believe I play almost exclusively now on my Xbox One, soon to be Xbox X. But my point is, that is because I've already subscribed to the service. It makes all of those games effectively free to play for me, and I can still buy things in those games that I give a monkeys about, that I care about, that I want. I wanted the Red Rocket items in Fallout 76 because then I could make a really cool Red Rocket cafeteria style base. You know, my camp is full of that stuff. I love that. And when somebody stumbles upon my camp, I want them to be delighted by the things that I've got. When I stumble on other people's camps in the world, I'm delighted by the things that they've got that I don't. And I choose to do that, despite the fact that I'm paying for the subscription to the whole Xbox Game Pass service. So it's economically sustainable, but it's also delight sustaining as well. But if you have an all-you-can-eat, you kill that stone dead. So I'm hoping to get across. There's really every game has different context. So whether it's a sort of simplest hyper-casual mobile game, and actually I'd argue that The Amazing Fall Guys is basically a hyper-casual on PC kind of experience. They're going to have different needs and wants in terms of monetization and play and player value, and they're going to have different levels of complexity. As the depth and complexity increases, the opportunity for interesting, complex monetization increases. But the juxtaposition of that is the potential reach of the audience for your game will decrease. So we have to pay that into attention as well. Content isn't a DLC pack with lots of expensive levels. Now, complex and expensive levels can be good because they're really interesting. But I think, in general, not every game is going to be the same, but in general, I would much rather give everybody access to the really expensive levels I've made and get them to want to buy smaller things because they're playing the game. How much do they spend on upgrades to health potions? How much do they spend on repair packs? Because they're enjoying the new level. Quite often, new level-based content is much, much more valuable as a retention mechanic than it is if you charge for it. So understanding that is going to be really key. So what is content if it's not level packs? Well, it's the ability to collect stuff. What is this month's collection? Think about Halloween. If each week you release new content, some of which is chargeable, some of which is free, and I want to collect it all, that's a really exciting experience for a lot of people. It's not necessarily hugely expensive to make. But that task-led activity encourages gameplay. And that gameplay encourages investment engagement with the game. Therefore, encourages a better experience. That's real content. Progression. Seeing my character progress. Where the Path of Exiles allows that progression over a period of time, then resets each quarter. That's a really... Well, I mean, not quite each quarter, but you know what I'm saying. That's a really interesting way of thinking about game design. but I still have the sense of progression. And that sense of progression keeps me playing, keeps me engaged with the game. Oh, wait, there's a pattern here for me. Optimization. I'm a massive fan of the hot dog way of thinking of games. So think about it from the point of view of, I've got 8 hot dogs, I've got 6 hot dog buns. That means I've always got extra hot dogs. I need more buns, so I buy more buns. I've now got lots of buns available. So what am I trying to do with that? Keeping that player on a task of trying to continuously optimize is really interesting. That's why I keep playing Fallout 76. That's why I kept playing the Long Dark. In order for my characters to stay alive, I had to constantly do these side tasks to keep me interested in playing. And I'm looking for other tasks and other objects which help me sustain that, but keep ratcheting up the kind of engagement level. Again, optimization actions, fantastic content. Narrative. In fact, not just narrative of the player of the story of the game world, but also the player's journey. So what is the player's journey? How do you intrinsically create personal lore that they can share, that gives them social capital? How do you create narrative lore, which creates depth and ambiguity, which allows people to find forms of discussion, which allows the world to take on a shape and form bigger than your designers possibly could have thought of? And then finally, real content is other players. How do other players affect why people invest in the game? How does that meaningfully drive why they want to spend money in your game? It's no good just thinking about the old Facebook kind of virality stuff. We have to think about why players drive me to want to play more if we're going to build a business out of our games. And actually, if we do that well, if we do that positively, and we do that with an open mind and love for our players, we create better experiences for everybody. I think it really comes down to thinking about the player life cycle. So we have to break our game and our thinking about a game in terms of that process. If our game is start, finish, done, that's it. Fine, no problem. But we have to still think about that discovery stage. We've got to think about the learning stage. Learning stage is where they not just work out the controls and have the worst experience they're going to have in your game, because frankly, if you think about it, they don't know what you're expecting. They haven't really committed that much emotionally to it. So, you've got to get them past all those barriers and find a way to build a routine if this is an ongoing game. So we have to try and find a way to stop them churning for life cycle based games. If we don't, then we're just doing product management, charge up front. Why not? Think about your sales pricing. Think about how you're going to sustain interest over time and manage the long term. That's okay. But actually, if you're going to have long-term sustainability, then we're looking to build engagement. We're looking to build reasons for people to super engage. Stop thinking about whales. Whales is just a disastrous way to think, and it's not a good model for games. It's a great model for gambling, where we're hosting a gambling casino. We're trying to get people who are going to spend tens of thousands of dollars before they leave. Yeah, give them free rooms, give them space to play, give them tickets to the theatre for their families, but they're going to stay in your casino until they've spent all that money. That's what Wales is about. What we're trying to do is find people who love your games as fans, as people who are passionate about your game. And some super engagers, spending $1 a month is super engaging. For others, spending $1,000 a month is super engaging. What we have to work out is what is valuable to those players that would make them want to do that. And do that fairly, with an open mind, with love for the experience. And doing that well creates more sustainable, more profitable, more valuable experiences for players. Sustaining them, re-engaging them, all of this stuff is really important. So if we're looking at life cycle, there are a number of factors we need to think about. I've talked about price, I've talked about expectation, and actually it's interesting how little elasticity there is once you set a price up front for how big that price should be. Again, it depends on the expectation of production values. If you're doing the pay up front model, we have to think about where we can generate additional revenue in charge, particularly if we have ongoing sustainable costs. If we have to manage servers, if we have to manage audience, we've got to find some way to pay that, or we're just cutting out our profitability. Now, you could incorporate that in your charge, but frankly, that's a much riskier basis than actually building it into kind of an ongoing model. Battle passes can be really good for that if you do that wisely, but that does require a level of sustainability. But again, focusing on extra value is going to be the way to go. But also, in that ongoing release, we need to think about things like DLC as well. If you're going to go down that pay up front one, why would people buy the DLC rather than churn? And it does tend to be a much smaller proportion of people doing that DLC. But doing that once is no good. Doing that in 6 months' time after release is generally no good. Sustainable, predictable releases is really important. And hopefully I've explained to you that content is not necessarily these massive DLC packs. It's actually more about the collectability, the other players, the sense of purpose and progression and narrative. It doesn't have to be massive, massive pieces of content. If we're doing in-game, the picture is a lot more complex, and not everybody is geared up to do this. I totally understand that. But it's not as daunting as you might think. Paying up front completely smashes the scale that you're going to get with a in-app purchase based game. But also the idea that price setting the value for a game is something to pay attention to. We have to look at all of our different sources, and actually it's much harder to do user acquisition on PC than it is on mobile, although there are some people we know of who are looking for ways to get around that problem. Getting people to go through that process of sustaining and motivating them is about activating them. It's about converting them. And then once we've converted them, it's about managing that to create a sense of ongoing community and giving them real value. There's nothing better than to get social capital from people saying good things about what we do. And there's nothing better for conversion than seeing other people who really value what they've bought in a game. And actually, if we do that well, then our community becomes truly viral, truly growth-based, because they're driving retention and engagement from other people. So I'm hoping I've given you a very rapid route through ways of thinking about pricing. I'm happy to take questions. I'll happily hang around as long as people want to, but what I want to get across is kind of this. Having pay up front has a price. As long as you understand what it is, that's okay. Price will impact scale, but it will also set expectation. And you have to ask yourself a fundamental question: is your game replayable or not? If it's not genuinely, repeatedly replayable, then pay up front is perfectly acceptable. But you have to understand what price says. What, by setting a price, you're saying about the quality, production values, experience, and community of your game. It's not just about a number. You've got to create a sense of anticipation and desire, as well as a sense of fear of missing out, if you're going to get people to buy a game up front. But even if it's free to play, you have to consider that risk. You've got to consider their anticipation, even just to make sure they make enough space to install it. To be bothered to actually play is not trivial. You've got to build value, and you do that by building engagement. It's not just about pricing structures, but if you've got ongoing delivery, you will have ongoing costs. So you want to make sure that you've got ongoing and increasing and ideally scalable revenues. And I think that's going to come down to how effectively you can leverage live ops. Having predictable, repeatable events, promotions, and experiences will drive engagement. And we know that engagement drives revenue. There's a very simple stat we worked out back in the early days of mobile, about 2014. At Unity, we did this research. Basically, when people started playing a mobile game, they were willing, if they spent about an hour playing, they were willing to spend on average around 66 cents. By 10 hours of extended play, they were willing to spend around $15. We also saw that about 2% of people were willing to spend after about an hour, and about 60% of people were willing to spend after about 10 hours. Whatever the world you're living in, people who invest in a game, who spend time in a game, the longer they spend time in a game, the more they filter who actually cares about the game, and the more likely they are to want to invest in the game if they love it. The risk is, if you create a false impression that this is all about money, you will find a massive group of players who, for them, part of the fun is how to avoid spending. That's a mistake. If you end up down that line, you've done something wrong. In fact, what I would say, if to sum it all up, is one of the biggest and most important factors for success, in my view, is repeat purchase. If you have paid upfront games, how many of your players buy more than one of your games? If you have an in-app purchase based game, how many people buy more than one in-app purchase? And if you don't have a large proportion of the people who spend repeat purchasing, you've got something wrong. And if you've got something wrong, you need to look back at the data, you need to talk to your players, and you need to invest in making an experience that they care about. Because that is what they're buying. They are not buying a number. The number sets expectation. The number is a gateway. What we want to sell is value. So hopefully that gives you a good sense of how to rethink the way we look at pricing and how it applies to PC games. Hopefully we've given a few examples along the way. Just so you know, we're a company that focuses on helping games with live operations in particular. But we also do a whole bunch of stuff. So for example, if you've got a game and you want to have somebody look at your pitch deck, assess the market fit, game mechanic, and so on and so forth, we do a free review. We do that based off your gameplay video and any pitch deck you've got. You can happily send that over to us. If you go to hi@fundamentally.games, you'll be able to contact us. We'll happily send that to you. Also, we have an events calendar and a finances list. So if you're looking for investment, the finances list talks about what people are out there by category who are investing. An events calendar shows what events are coming up as well in the game side. We also have a knowledge base where we take recordings of events like this and we share them, articles we've written, and various other things like that. So hopefully that gives you a sense of how we can help you along the way. So anyway, that's the webinar. I'd love to know what you think and see what questions you have. So Albert, hey there, man. I haven't seen you. I haven't seen anyone in ages, but I haven't seen you in ages. Even before lockdown, I hadn't seen you for a while. So Albert is asking. He says, I've just shifted this screen. How the increasing importance of third-party subscription services, Game Pass, etc., affect how you manage to communicate the game value over the lifetime again? That is a fantastic question. I think the crux of this is really understanding where you're placing your game and why. You're not going to mostly just end up in one of those platforms. I think if you're thinking about the live operations of your game in general, that you're managing that separately, but in parallel with the events and activities that the platform itself is managing. I think it's a lot easier if you're a free-to-play game, but if you happen to have a PC game that's got an upfront charge and you go into, console game that's going into Xbox Game Pass and it had an upfront charge originally, then obviously you're dealing with that relationship with Xbox, and you need to make sure that you build in the ability for you to be able to do that charging and pricing mechanism using their app stores, just like you would with any game. Normal stuff. But it's how you communicate in and outside of your game, as well as leveraging the communication channels in the platform itself. Now, as I understand it, there aren't that many opportunities to communicate within the Xbox Game Pass process itself. There are some, but there's not a lot. So you cannot rely on them. You have to make sure that you integrally build in your startup process and your in-game process and your in-game stores what that means to players. How do you create desire, incentive, and so on and so forth? But the joy of a game as a service is we don't have to build everything at once. So if you didn't build that at day one, that's okay. It means that you're going to have you get through the lean period as you adapt, but you need to listen and adjust accordingly. I would say that everybody should have a mechanism at the start of their game which allows them to do a message of the day at the very least, ideally with an image and some text. If there is ability to have a call to action, at the very least an email address so that people can go to you, not necessarily go via the store to get feedback and information and so on and so forth, then I would suggest you do that too. So all of that, as long as the the subscription service you're working with permits it, of course. So anything you do to create this one-to-one dialogue is great. But also, highlight the social media feed that you've got. Where's your Discord channel? How does that fit into your integration conversation? So formulating a way that you communicate the value should always be in a tone of voice that works with your community, your retail strategy, and your general game marketing. You want consistency of messaging, an integration approach to make that work. And then you basically think about, here is my schedule. I've got this daily, this weekly, this monthly activity. I'm going to put this sales message to support that activity. Then I'm going to pipeline that across. It's basically about pipelining. It's about systematic, ongoing, continuous support. Does that make sense? Cool. Does anyone else have any questions? Always happy to answer anything. So, I mean, what I'm hoping I get across is that the pricing up. I don't think that paying up front is generally a good idea. Thanks, Alexander. I generally don't think paying up front is a good idea in most cases, but there are some games where that's not true. There are some games where, it just wouldn't make sense. Now, the other thing is that there are some games where it would just fundamentally change what the game is. That's okay. So for example, Don't Starve, I totally get why that's a pay up front game. But if I don't think you have any problem making a free-to-play version of that game, but it would profoundly impact what that game was. And so that's why I think it's important to understand what the value is to the player, because if you start making a free-to-play Don't Starve, you're profoundly changing what the value proposition is. So understanding that's going to be really important. Anyway, so unless there's any other questions, hopefully I've given you something. We will make available a recording of one of the sessions from today, and I'll share out the slides from today as well. So obviously, please let me know if you have any questions on the way. Otherwise, I'll say thank you very much for joining me, and hopefully we'll speak again soon.